Okay, I've tried to start this video a whole bunch of times, but the cat is scratching at the door, and I feel dreadful. So if I'm sweating, or if I look bad, or if I sound bad, that's because I am bad. Anyway, She Who Became the Sun is fantastic. It is a retelling of the story of the man who founded and became first emperor of the Ming Dynasty in China. The Ming Dynasty started in the late 14th century, and he was emperor for about 30 years. But this is a complete reimagining of his origin story. Now, famously, Zhu Yuanzhang, who was the first emperor of the Ming Dynasty, was a peasant. Then he became a monk. Then he became the leader of a rebel army who rose up against the Mongols that were currently occupying all of China, and he defeated them and became the first emperor of the Ming Dynasty. And this is that story. This is the story of Zhu Yuanzhang, but it's completely different. But it's not. It's queer. That's the easiest way to put it. It is a queer retelling of the story of Zhu Yuanzhang, and it's wonderful. I love Chinese history. I love Chinese mythology. I read a lot of Chinese literature, and I have lived in China, and so I was very, very excited to read this. And Shelley Parker-Chan has done an exquisite job of transforming the life of a pretty legendary figure in Chinese history into something wholly fresh and exciting. So She Who Became the Sun begins in a poverty-stricken village in nowhere. It begins with a family, a father and his two children, a boy and a girl. They are literally starving in Mongol-controlled China. They are just a family of nobody peasants. But the father takes his kids to this fortune teller, and the fortune teller says that the son, Zhu Chongba, will become a legend. He will find greatness. This is a word that is repeated throughout the novel, greatness. And the daughter will be nothing, nobody. But the novel is told from the daughter's perspective. And within the first chapter, we learn this, and then the house is raided by highwaymen. The father is killed, the son dies, and the daughter is all that's left. And at the very end of chapter 1, she says to herself, no, I've survived, I have to do something. And so she takes her brother's name. She takes her brother's identity, she embodies Zhu Chongba, and she goes out into the world to find life, to survive, and maybe even succeed at something. She goes to a monastery and she sits outside for 4 days waiting for someone to let her in. And we are told that that is the longest that anyone has sat outside the monastery waiting to come in. And from here, in chapter 2, and maybe chapter 3 as well, we get the whole story of her disguised as a boy monk at this monastery, going through her teen years, trying to hide herself and becoming very, very good friends with another apprentice monk who's about 2 or 3 years older than her. And it's quite a fun story. There's a lot of funny things that happen to her. She really forges her personality here as someone who is very cheeky, who is very savvy, who is able to get out of awkward situations, who uses her mind to succeed and to avoid difficult situations, and continue to live a very difficult life in this monastery. And these chapters are a lot of fun, honestly. They set up the character as someone who is able to survive on her wits, her humor, her ingenuity, her savvy. She's a brilliant character. Now, as I keep talking, I'm going to refer to her as she, although the pronouns here are pretty difficult, because all the way through the novel, Zhu Chongba is disguised as a boy, and later a man. But the novel, the narrative, Shelley Parker-Chan, continues to refer to her as she. And as the book goes on, and I'm not going to call this a spoiler, even though it's discussed a little bit later, I'm not going to give you the details. She has a conversation with someone who has learned her secret. As the book goes on, you know that a select few people will figure out her secret. And she's discussing this with one of them, and she does not refer to herself as male or female, man or woman. And this is a really interesting moment, because the pronoun she continues to be used. People who don't know her secret continue to refer to her as he and him, but she does not identify as either. She has lived her life in this disguise, and so she simply says that she has the body of a woman, but she is identified as a man, and therefore you put those two things together and you get someone who is both and neither. And this is, as a non-binary person, something that's very, very exciting to me. I loved reading how Shelley Parker-Chan, who I believe also identifies as non-binary, I'm not entirely sure, how they choose to express this gender spectrum within one person. The queerness, the gender queerness of this book is what makes it interesting to a point, as well as this historical epic that's being told. Zhu Chongba is a very, very interesting character, and what we see here is them going on this enormous fantasy epic. It's not a fantasy epic, but it feels like one. There is so much that happens here in about 400 pages. It is a true fantasy epic. If you love fantasy novels, you need to read She Who Became the Sun, because it has true fantasy energy. It's also historical fiction, and it's also a queer retelling. It's a lot of things. If you love the retellings of Greek mythology that have been published a lot recently over the last few years, you'll probably love this. If you love historical fiction, you'll love this. And if you love fantasy, you'll love this. And if you are queer in any way, you'll love this. There's so much to enjoy here, not least of which is our antagonist. In many ways, the antagonist of this book is the most interesting character. They are also a kind of a queer character. This person is called Ouyang. Ouyang is a eunuch and a very powerful general of the Mongol army. This entire novel is kind of a Cold War. As Zhu Chongba is going through her life as a monk in disguise, and then, true to history, a rebel leader, there is also an antagonist whose story is getting told at the same time. After Zhu Chongba leaves the monastery, part 1 of this 3-part novel ends. And starting in part 2, we get 2 narratives told side by side. We continue to look at Zhu Chongba and what she's up to as she's escaping the monastery and rising up through the ranks of this rebel army to gain power against the Mongols. And we're also getting Ouyang's story as well as a Mongol general. But Ouyang is not a Mongol by birth. He was of a family who were all killed by the Mongols. His father, his brothers, everyone in his family was killed except for him. He was turned into a eunuch and made into a kind of slave soldier and rose up through the ranks to become a general of the Mongol army. And so he is not one of them. He is also a difficult, haunted person with nothing to hide. Everyone knows that he's a eunuch, but he has a lot to prove as a result. And so even calling him the antagonist is a little bit misleading. In a Game of Thrones kind of way, what starts out as an antagonist becomes a protagonist as we continue to have our eyes on him as the story progresses. Ouyang is such a fascinating character, especially when pitted head-to-head with Zhu Chongba. The two of them are very, very similar people. They are survivors, and they have survived in this hyper-masculine world where everything is against them. They are on opposite sides, they have opposing beliefs and opinions and feelings to a point, but they are also not faithful to anyone but themselves. They are people who have what could be seen in this world as a kind of a disability. One is a woman in disguise who must prove herself to be a man in a man's world, and the other is a eunuch. And repeatedly throughout this book, people refer to him as being basically a woman or basically a child because he is not a true man. And this masculine world is explored with such sensitivity, a little bit of anger, but mostly savvy and intrigue even. These two characters represent so much in terms of feminism and queer culture in a very, very interesting way, in such a way that I really could do a dedicated video on it, and I probably wouldn't even do it justice. I think that trying to unpack and explain and just use words to describe the ways in which Ouyang and Zhu Chongba represent queerness in the social space or even the political space of today and yesteryear, there's too much for me to unpack here. These two characters represent so much, and I truly love them both as protagonists, especially considering neither of them are wholly good people at all. Ouyang is very much self-interested, while constantly being battered and berated and forced to prove himself. And Zhu Chongba goes from being a survivor to being pretty aggressive and bloodthirsty. As I said, this whole novel is a Cold War between two states, the Mongols who are controlling China and this rising rebel faction. So it feels kind of like the first Star Wars movie. I compare things to Star Wars on this channel so often. Constantly, these two are pitted against each other and kind of waiting for the big main event, the big battle. And so much of parts 2 and 3 of this novel are just small, contained political conversations. We flip between the rebel camp and the Mongol horde. Is that okay to say? Probably. And while we're focused on these two areas, all we're getting are political conversations. In fact, it feels very, very Shakespearean. It feels like Macbeth. It feels like Julius Caesar. It has a real Julius Caesar feel to it, where so much of it is just these tactical chess games being played, where people stab each other in the back, where people take over from each other, where people disagree and fight and argue, and yet the war itself isn't actually happening. It feels very Shakespearean in that way, and I loved it for that. Julius Caesar is my favourite Shakespeare play. There's so much to enjoy here. The only negative that I have is that occasionally the book seems to move too quickly and cover too much ground, while also being slow. As I said, these conversations, these very political chess games, can drag a little bit, and you can even get lost in what plans they're trying to create and come up with and enact next, while also things kind of jump forward in time a few months or even years. And when Zhu Chengba escapes the monastery, I wasn't even sure how she managed it. It's kind of glossed over. But she and Ouyang are incredible rivals. They are Luke and Vader, to reference Star Wars again. They are truly two sides of the same coin, whilst also simultaneously being entirely different people. They have so much in common and so many differences, and it makes them really amazing rivals in this novel. And once part 2 starts, and you're getting Ouyang's perspective and journey as well, the amount of empathy and sympathy you have to give to this novel as a reader is really incredible. It's really intense. Alright, I'm not feeling very well, and I'm not sure how well I've done in talking about this book, so I'm just going to stop this here. But She Who Became the Sun really is a fantastic book. I've had so much fun reading this. A queer retelling of a Chinese historical epic is one hell of an undertaking, and Shelley Parker-Chan has done an astonishing job with it. And these characters are such complex people. This was a genius feat of historical retelling, and I'm so glad that we've got it. Check out She Who Became the Sun. It is absolutely worth the hype. And subscribe for books.